The name's Rex. But you'll call me Captain or Sir.
War does not come with a guarantee. No soldier gets the promise of safety.
My designation is Trooper 27-5555, sir.
We call him Fives.
I'm Heavy.
This is Echo. I'm Commander Cody, your new boss.
Sir, yes, sir!
Looks like we got ourselves a batch of shinies, Commander.
Look around. We're one and the same. Same heart, same blood. Your training is in your blood. And my blood's boiling for a fight.
So this is our home. Any idea what
This is our war.
This can't be good.
We need to pull back. Get them to follow us. If we can draw them out, we can see them. If we can see them, we can hit them.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Republic Outpost Radio, your Star Wars podcast here on the MediaByte YouTube channel. As always, I am your host, Sean Hussey, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, Nathan Hicks. What's going on, Nate?
Not much. What's going on?
Not much. Excited to talk some Star Wars this week with you. We got a lot of new Star Wars information this week and stuff, but we're going to talk about a little something different this week. So, Nate, I'm going to actually let you introduce this topic. It's something that you and I have been talking about doing for a little while, and luckily, thanks to that Vanity Fair article that we talked about a couple weeks ago, as well as a video, I was going to say Vidoc, but a video that I found on YouTube. It looks like Vanity Fair, on top of their article, released a brief video about the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy, and about the comparisons and differences between the two of those. And there was some stuff that J.J. Abrams and the cast and crew talked about on set as well. But I thought it'd be a great topic for us to get into this week. So, Nate, I'll let you kind of kick off with where we want to start the conversation.
Yeah, so the video was great. Just getting a little bit of an inside perspective on you know, everything from different character comparisons between, you know, certain characters from, you know, A New Hope, and then from like Force Awakens, blah blah blah. It was really interesting, and for me as a fan of the sequels and actually really liking them, it was nice to hear someone really put into words in an accessible way, I guess, like my thoughts on the sequel trilogy and why I personally don't think Force Awakens in particular is like a rehash of A New Hope. And that's where I want to start off, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. So, you know, we often get the comparisons of how The Force Awakens is just this rehash of A New Hope. And I recently got to sit down. I think you did as well. I think both The Force Awakens for the both of us have been the last Star Wars movie we saw recently. And I think that, you know, it gets a lot of flack for being a New Hope ripoff. And I used to think that myself personally. And then I rewatched it and I was completely changed on my opinion on that topic. And I realized that, you know, there's similarities, of course, and there's a lot of homage, but there isn't as much similarity as we would think. Particularly just the fact that, yes, The Force Awakens does follow that hero's journey that we talked about in the podcast last week, but there's just a lot of differences in the approach. And while the story is very similar, I think JJ and Lawrence Kasdan really approached it from we're paying homage, not trying to copy the past. So, you know, that's just what I thought about that.
You know, and one thing too, and I remember saying this, and I remember friends of mine also saying this, is when leading up to The Force Awakens coming out, a lot of us we wanted the movies to feel like Star Wars again. And the prequel trilogy does, but there was something about, you know, the original trilogy that we wanted to feel again with the sequels. And in my opinion, that's exactly what we got with The Force Awakens. I mean, as soon as it's that opening scene, you know, you're seeing that ship coming down. You know, you've got Poe Dameron talking to what's his name, and you know, I mean, you got the stormtroopers rushing out of the ship, like shooting everything up. Like, oh, it feels so good. It feels so Star Wars. I love it.
No, absolutely. I think we've got, you know, you were talking about how it just kind of gets right into it. And I think that a lot of people, their expectations were just slightly altered, or just they weren't sure what they were expecting. I don't know if I'd agree with you on that prequel point. I like to think of the prequels are very Star Wars, but to each their own on that one. But I will say that we definitely were worried because, one, Disney was going to be making a Star Wars movie, and we didn't know if Disney would be able to capture that Star Wars magic again. And, you know, we also had J.J. Abrams, who I think a lot of people knew was a very talented filmmaker, but after seeing his Star Trek films, although those Star Trek films felt very Star Wars-y, I also recently sat down and rewatched those as well. I was worried. You know, I didn't know what we were going to be getting, if this was going to feel like Star Wars, it was going to feel like something Disney made. I think JJ did a really good job, but I think that those comparisons are meant to be there, and I think we'll later kind of get into how The Last Jedi sort of readjusted what we thought Star Wars was and how Star Wars-y that is really. But for JJ, at least, at The Force Awakens, there was definitely a lot of Star Wars-esque stuff going on.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I had a friend ask me, this is before, you know, Disney had acquired Lucasfilm, and they were like, you know, if another Star Wars movie was ever going to be made, who would you want to direct it? And I said off the top of my head, J.J. Abrams, because his Star Trek was awesome. So, I was very happy with Force Awakens.
Yeah, I definitely was not disappointed. I think coming out, I was pretty happy. And then I rethought about it, and I was less enthused with what it was and what it ended up being. And then after rewatching, I was happy again. You know, I was like, you know, this is a really good Star Wars movie. I can't remember exactly where I ranked it. I'd want to say somewhere like 4 or 5. For Star Wars for me, but I still really like that movie. I still really like what it stands for and what it entered into a new era of Star Wars for us. But instead of just talking about just that, let's go into the story a little bit, talk about, you know, those similarities and differences more in depth. Do you want to start with plot, or do you want to start with characters?
I want to start with characters. I really want to touch on, you know, Rey versus Luke in A New Hope.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've got two very different characters at the core. I think that at the time we thought, okay, this is kind of like our Luke of the story, and Rey, of course, is our Luke of the story. But we've got a very different kind of situation in between the two of them. And I noticed this after watching that video from Vanity Fair. Just the fact that Luke was kind of this like boy who had family, had loved ones, even though he didn't have parents, like he was still, you know, he still had somebody taking care of him. He still had people that loved him, and he didn't really have any goals, or he wanted to go to the academy, but like outside of that, he wasn't waiting for anything. He wasn't trying to, you know, set his path necessarily. As for Rey, you know, she's very self-reliant. She was able to, you know, not only she was waiting for her family, but she takes care of herself. She's a scavenger. Those two characters at their core seem very similar, but, you know, in reality, they're not all that similar.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Luke had a pretty, I'm not going to say easy. I mean, he was a farmer, but he had a simple lifestyle, you know, before the droids ended up on his doorstep. And, you know, Rey grew up very differently. You know, having to work for everything from, you know, a child up until we meet her in The Force Awakens, and that definitely makes, you know, for a more hardened individual. And I'd say Rey is definitely, you know, not whining about what was it, power converters,
Tashi Station.
Tashi Station.
Yeah.
So, you know, it really is an interesting juxtaposition between our two, protagonists from the original trilogy and now the sequels. It's like, like you said with the hero's journey earlier, they're kind of like the same protagonists, but they're very different people emotionally.
Yeah, I would agree. Do you want to touch more on the two of them? I mean, we could talk a little bit. I think we could use this opportunity to go into like The Last Jedi, and just where Rey's character has been going, versus where Luke's character goes. We know that, Rey kind of faces her dark side cave in The Last Jedi as well. She has to face that issue of like who her parents are, versus Luke kind of coming to that realization and discovery that Vader is his father. But I think that The Last Jedi really sets it apart, not only because The Last Jedi is such a very different Star Wars movie, and whether or not you like or hate The Last Jedi is not really relevant to what our conversation is today, but just in terms of what the characters go through, and we'll use Luke Skywalker big time to talk about The Last Jedi, of course, but I just really like that Rey's journey feels a lot different. I think that ultimately after Episode 9, she's going to feel like a very different character than Luke Skywalker, which I love, and she already does, but I think that'll only grow after Episode 9. But, you look at Luke in Empire, and like he's kind of learning how to train, and so is Rey. But Luke's training is sort of all about how he wants to get back to his friends and his inability of patience, whereas Rey is having this struggle where Luke doesn't really want to train her, and she feels like she's been betrayed, whereas Luke, training with Yoda, just was stubborn and unable to finish his training, and kind of almost in a way fell corrupted to the dark side, just in the way that he was tempted by Vader into the trap. And I think that makes a big difference.
Well, there's also kind of a big maturity difference between the two characters at this point in their lives. Luke is... Yeah,
I would agree.
Luke is, he's there to train, but, his thoughts are elsewhere. He doesn't have that patience. He's wanting to just get it done, get back to the fight, and he wants the quick and easy. And he's struggling with the quick and easy versus actually learning from Yoda and taking the training to heart. Whereas Rey is like wide open, like, I'm here to buckle down and get serious and learn this stuff, and here you are, being senile. So
yeah.
It really shows a big difference in their maturity and honestly their outlook on the Force, even at that point in time in their lives.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that a big part of Rey's character is that she looks at the Force as like this legend thing. She looks at Luke as this legend. And Luke, meanwhile, like has not even really known what the Force is. There's like this very different interpretation of the Force depending on the time. Like, of course, during the Age of the Empire, people did not want you to know about the Force. And in terms of the sequel trilogy, like the characters know the Force exists, but they look at it as almost like myth or legend. And Rey is just so impressed by all of these war heroes that she's encountering and that she's part of the fight now. Meanwhile, Luke kind of doesn't know exactly what he's doing and what he's becoming a part of.
Yeah, for sure, man. I mean, we can almost... geez, Luke is such a big character, too, to really get in on this with. But...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot we could go into. Do you want to move over to Luke then and kind of talk about his shift and his similarities to fan favorite Obi-Wan, and like talk about old Luke versus Obi-Wan in this original trilogy?
Yeah, well, let's definitely do that because talking about Rey and Luke, comparing them in their journey. Rey's journey is that's kind of where she ends, is shortly after her training with Luke. So it's a good place to start with Luke right there, in comparison to Obi-Wan. When Luke met Obi-Wan was old man, wise, and I'd say even still very powerful. And he was very, I'd say Obi-Wan was very confident in who he was and his skills, I guess you could say. He was comfortable with everything. And we look at Luke in The Last Jedi, and that guy, he's just ain't having it. He's ran from everything. You know, he shut himself off from the Force. Like none of the calm poise that Obi-Wan carried around that same time. You know.
Yeah, absolutely not. I think again it comes down to the timing. Obi-Wan, of course, feels like he failed, and so does Luke. But there's a difference where, you know, Obi-Wan knows now about Luke and knows that there's hope, whereas Luke wasn't expecting that. And then when Rey comes knocking on his doorstep, he kind of feels like it's too late. And whereas Luke was kind of born into this prophecy, born into this bloodline, Rey, as far as we know, was not. So for Luke to kind of take on Rey as this apprentice, not really sure what to do with himself, not really sure how to move forward, not even sure if he's willing to take somebody under his wing again, says a lot about just his difference of opinion with the character and his differences from Obi-Wan, but yet still creates this really interesting, complex character, which some people love, some people hate, but regardless, it's just who the character is.
Well, one thing I wanna mention in regards to that is, you know, Obi-Wan's apprentice turned to the dark side, you know, and
right.
And Obi-Wan, you know, he didn't shut himself off from the Force. You know, he didn't lose all hope. He did what he had to do, and you know, maintained himself, I guess. Whereas, you know,
yeah, but as you know, as I was saying, there's like a big difference there as well, because Obi-Wan knew Luke existed, and like his job became to, you know, look over Luke and
right.
to kind of train Luke eventually. And we know from the Star Wars comics that Obi-Wan did do some minor training with Luke in his early years. But then Uncle Owen kind of shut that off. But like as for Luke, you know, Kylo was everything, and he lost Kylo, and he wasn't expecting anybody else to come into the picture.
Yeah.
It makes sense for him to shut himself off from the Force and, you know, kind of give up in a sense. He kind of didn't think, you know, we learned a lot from, you know, the novelizations of The Last Jedi and comics and stuff, that Luke sort of fell into this belief that he was the legendary Luke Skywalker. And as a result, he ultimately kind of cost himself and got too overconfident in his skills, because he just thought that he was just the best. And that ultimately when he failed, he realized that he wasn't. Because I think that this was something that was just a normal character trope of the time. But if you look at who Luke Skywalker was, he wasn't a character that really had a lot of struggle. You know, he lost his hand, but other than that, I mean, Luke definitely did not have to struggle as a hero. You know, he kind of always just won, and he had some temptation, but it was never really hard for Luke, which I think is a very different approach to just how hero stories are told now versus back then.
Yeah, and I mean, that's also something that we had talked about a long time ago when, you know, we had one of our nights gaming and just talking Star Wars. You know, because I remember I had to spew that as kind of like, you know, my reason for liking the direction of Luke, and a lot of people didn't agree with me that, you know, it was his pride essentially that made him do what he did to turn Kylo. So yeah, it's a really, really awesome, I think, place to take his character, because, you know, he was the chosen hero, and then to see that, I mean, it's not necessarily a fall, but to see that slip, it makes for a really, really compelling story, you know, for for him as a character.
Absolutely. And we also know that, Obi-Wan as a character was training and had more, as you were saying, didn't cut himself off and was constantly working with Qui-Gon and communicating with Yoda and trying to make sure that, he was keeping himself ready for whatever fight came next. And ultimately, that fight came against Vader in the Death Star. And for Luke, that fight came against Kylo on Crate.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Of course, you have to wonder now, like, if Luke had never shut himself off from the Force, if that battle would have killed him or not. But I think that's something that you'd have to think about.
I don't know. Well, that's an interesting thing to think about right there. I mean, I don't know.
Like Obi-Wan got cut down, but like if Luke hadn't cut himself off,
Obi-Wan allowed himself to be cut down.
Well, right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But like Obi-Wan, knew what he was doing, and knew that he was going to die, and Luke did too. But you have to wonder, like, had Luke not cut himself off from the Force, being as powerful as he was, had he not, cut himself off, would he have survived that battle?
I think that's something we can talk about on a later episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree.
So,
so where do we want to go next? I mean, there's a lot of characters you can make similarities to.
Yeah, I mean, going with characters, we can. I guess
you want to talk about Kylo and Vader?
I do want to talk about Kylo and Vader. That's a fun one as well.
Yeah, because honestly, I don't really have many comparisons at all to the two of them. There's really not a lot of similarity there, if you ask me.
There's definitely not. Well, I mean, the similarities are superficial. It's the mask. It's the colors.
Yeah.
It's one looking up to the other and trying to be that, but can't. And that's what's really cool about this comparison. I mean, Vader was the big bad. I mean, he was a monster, and everyone except probably the Emperor was terrified of him. Like, you knew if Vader was coming, I mean, that was it. And then you got Kylo over here. He's trying to be that, so he wears the mask and he's got the black clothes, and he just comes off as a child, and I don't know, it's just it's a pale imitation, and I love it.
Yeah. I mean, oh, do you? Okay, I was gonna say, because you sounded like you were like about to say like you just don't like Kylo's character.
Oh no, I love it. I love it.
I love Kylo. But I think what's interesting about him is he's kind of that aspect of Vader that we never saw, of the fact that like he's struggling with what side he's on and the pull to the light, and like those are things that we know Vader was experiencing, but we never really got to see them on screen. What helps big time is that Kylo has those, emotional attachments still available to him. Whether that be Leia or Han or even Rey, possibly, if there's some sort of past connection between the two of them. Luke. As for Vader, he had Obi-Wan, and then that's about it. Like, we know that Ahsoka was around, but Padme was dead. He wasn't really encountering Ahsoka during the original trilogy. We saw a little bit of that in Rebels, but for the most part, I mean, you just don't have that type of connection that Kylo has that makes him this character who's struggling. We see Kylo struggle because he has those things, around him,
right,
and that ultimately makes him somewhat of a more interesting character.
Yeah, Vader had a lot less to help that pull towards the light, which I think is part of the reason why he was always he had such good control over the anger, I guess you could say, Because, I mean, I would almost
Yeah.
say that Vader's anger was even greater than Kylo's, but he had...
Absolutely.
He had that control over it. And
You also have to look at, like, Vader was wounded, and
Yeah.
Vader had the suit, and I think Kylo's injuries are tough, but they are not nearly anything close to Vader's.
Right, and you know, his level of anger just it's not there. It's that it's that teenage rebelling against the parents type anger. It's
Yeah.
pale in comparison.
I mean, it's also that anger, just like that the world had betrayed you
yeah,
for one reason or another.
it's so good though. I love it.
Oh yeah, I don't like those like teenage bratty comparisons. Like I understand why they're made, but I Kylo's character at his heart is just somebody whose world around them, like in his mind, betrayed him, and that's something that I think a lot of people feel. It's not just like this teenage emotion thing that we related to.
Well, I mean,
And like he comes off as bratty, but
yeah, well, I mean, I feel like Kylo. I mean, his anger, in my opinion, is relatable, and that's why I love it. I mean, sure, everyone's gotten pissed off at their parents or their teachers or whatever, and sometimes it's serious, it's bad, and I for me it was super relatable, to have a character like Kylo where, I mean, yeah, he does come across as like a an emo kind of guy, I guess you could say. He's got he's mad. He's pissed off at the world, and like you said, the world's betrayed him or whatever, and that's it's a bit melodramatic, but I mean, we've all been there before, and that's what I love about it.
No, I think you're really right on that point. Similar, like if I'd like to see, the conversation for Kylo and I guess Rey too ultimately kind of comes down to where their paths go in episode 9, this is why this is something else we'll be re-looking at after episode 9. I think that there are certain characters in comparison, so we have a generally good idea of who we can compare and kind of understand who their characters are, but especially for Rey and Kylo, like we have to kind of wait and see what their paths unfold. I think Rey is pretty predictable. I think Kylo Ren is pretty predictable as well, but you never know what JJ has up his sleeve. Like I definitely think we're going to see Kylo get redeemed and he's going to die. But just, as much, I don't really want that, but I do think that that's where we're heading.
Yeah. I mean, that's where it seems like we're heading for sure. I'm still hoping for a couple more twists and turns on our journey towards the end.
Oh yeah, me too.
I want to make more of a stretch comparison real quick.
Okay, I have a couple too, so we'll go to yours next.
All right, so I stretch comparison. I want to talk about Han and Chewie, and then I want to talk about, compared to, I don't know, Poe and Finn.
Interesting. Okay.
A bit of a stretch there, but...
Who's Chewie? Is Finn Chewie?
Poe, because, I mean, granted, Chewie's in it more, but especially in Force Awakens, we get a lot less of Poe. So even though Chewie is a more active character in A New Hope, granted, he doesn't really...
I would go the other way, personally. I think Poe is your Han Solo, but...
You think so?
I do.
I mean, I see why.
Because there is no Princess Leia of this...
Right.
There is no Princess Leia.
I guess I'm kind of comparing it to like screen time and the character development time.
That's fine.
That's kind of where I'm looking at it, because like Chewie, all his dialogue is Han, and with Poe, right, we don't really get a whole lot of him. We get him at the very beginning, and then we get him there towards the end, and it's pretty short. But more so, I think Han and Finn, because I think they're both playing a specific role in comparison to the other characters. More so, I guess, Finn playing a specific role, but I think that role is more of, I feel like him and Rey kind of have this dual protagonist thing going on. Whereas in A New Hope, we had mostly Luke.
Just Luke.
but then later on it became Luke, Leia, and Han. So
Right.
I feel like early on, though, Finn is more of a protagonist than Han was. But I feel like his skill set, other than piloting, is actually fairly similar to Han. I mean, he's, in a way, Finn still kind of fits that scoundrel mold without actually being a scoundrel. You know what I mean?
Yeah, kind of like this character who's not really supposed to be a hero, but is a hero.
And that,
I see what you're saying.
yeah, and that brings up some interesting stuff too, because I mean, we all know Han was a pretty complex character, and he was that type of guy to shoot first.
Right.
He early on, it was all about the money, and he didn't want to get his hands dirty unless he absolutely had to. He was a scoundrel. I mean, he wasn't the most likable. He was a bit of an anti-hero. And then,
Right.
Instead with The Force Awakens, you've got Finn, who's basically also the protagonist, and, he's just, granted, he's on the run. That's all he wants to do. So, but you could see what I think is interesting is there's a level of courage that Han has that Finn doesn't have, even though he's still the protagonist.
I would agree. We are about 30 minutes in, so why don't we switch gears? There's one last character comparison I'd like to make, and then I think we can start talking about factions and just the overall world and story.
Okay.
So the last one I wanted to draw, and this is more differences than comparisons, and that'll still tie us into our factions. But I really would love to talk about the comparisons between Hux and Grand Moff Tarkin.
Oh, that's a good one.
Just because they kind of serve the same role. I think that Admiral Pride, I think his name is, it's Pride or Price. Price is on Rebels, and I think Pride is the new one for Episode 9. And that's Richard E. Grant's character.
Yeah.
I think he's going to be serving the real Tarkin role of that movie. But for now, as far as we know, Hux was set up to be this Grand Moff Tarkin character. So that's the comparison I want to make. Now, obviously, I think that a lot of Hux's character and his differences from Tarkin fall directly on the back of the differences between the Empire and the First Order. But we're going to get into those in a second. But obviously, Tarkin is meant to be this very intimidating figure, and is supposed to sort of play off that classic British evil guy trope. That's what Lucas was kind of going for with him. Meanwhile, Hux, at least in The Force Awakens, is pretty intimidating with his speech. But in The Last Jedi and even in parts of The Force Awakens, kind of comes off as this comic relief character. And I think that says a lot just about what the First Order is compared to the Empire and what the two different factions served in their respective times. But I what are you thinking on Hux and Tarkin?
Interestingly, I kind of see Hux and Tarkin as for me, the comparison is similar to that of Kylo and Vader. Of course, Tarkin being, that I mean, he was a big time general leader in the Empire.
Right.
Grand Moff Tarkin was a Grand Moff. He was up there, and then you got in The Force Awakens, you got Hux, who is basically, I guess, somewhat that for the First Order, but he also comes across as kind of bratty in a way as well. I mean, it's not nearly as much as Kylo, but you see, I think you see a little bit of that with his defiance towards Kylo, and in that what do you call it, that competitive type attitude he gives Kylo, and his ambition. So
yeah, I think that you've got a different dynamic between the two of them as well. Like Vader and Tarkin never looked at each other as competition,
right.
Whereas Kylo and Hux do. Not that, to say you can't compare the two, just...
But yeah, I mean, that's a good point to make.
The dynamics are different.
Yeah.
You, of course, got just so many things, and, as I was saying, a lot of what Hux and Tarkin's comparisons fall down to is just the comparisons between the First Order and the Empire, which is where I would love to head next.
Yeah.
Unless you have any other character comparisons or anything you want to hit on.
No.
All right, cool. So, obviously, we'll talk about the Resistance and the Rebellion, but I think the more interesting discussion is within the First Order and the Empire and what each of them kind of stand for, and how just the Empire was this just massive, armada of just power and control and no fear, and just just really think of themselves as the end all for the galaxy. And they really were. They were the military. They were the rulers of the galaxy. Whereas the First Order is a kind of almost terrorist group, where they're not technically in charge. After, you could say in between the destruction of Hosnian Prime and the up until the Snoke's death, which is like a day and a half, they were in complete control just because they didn't have to answer to anybody. They literally just killed the basically the ruling power in the galaxy. But the purpose of the First Order is not to maintain control, it's to regain control. And I think that dynamic makes them very different. But the First Order is sloppy. The First Order is, they make mistakes. They follow in the footsteps of people who have lost previously. We know a lot from canon just about Palpatine's contingency plans, and the First Order really wasn't part of it. It'll be interesting to see how much they play into that in the Episode 9, but if you had to ask me now, I don't think Palpatine would want anything to do with the First Order, nor when he returns will he have anything to do with the First Order. I think that his threat far exceeds anything that has to do with the First Order, and I think that it'll be sort of maybe played off for a joke, but a big surprise to players like Hux and Kylo that when Palpatine ultimately returns in whatever form, he has just absolutely no interest in what the First Order is doing or trying to rule the galaxy anymore.
What a kick in the balls that'll be,
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, I hope we get to see that. That'd be so good.
I don't know if they'll get around to actually addressing that, but I do think we'll have some sort of line from Palpatine just being like, you think I care about this? Like, this is what you think power is. That's not power. I think we've seen that dynamic a lot in just a lot of media where, people think that just control is power. And, I was watching the Dark Knight trilogy, and just they were talking about, there's that big, comparison to just money is not power. And control is power, and fear is power. And those are things that Palpatine preached, even though he was rich and built his empire on money, that was not his end goal. And we still honestly don't entirely know what his end goal was. We don't, it's been discussed in Lords of the Sith, which was a book. I can't remember the author. I want to say Chuck Wending, but I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. It was a good book though.
Yeah, but there was a line in there just about how Palpatine's end goal wasn't to rule the galaxy. That was just a step in the plan. We don't know what his end plan was. We know that he had plans for him and Vader. We know Vader had other plans as well. But we don't know ultimately what the Emperor's full plan was. He was always thinking just way outside of the pawns and the money and control. There's a lot more going on there. Whereas the First Order, kind of bringing my point back to the fold, is just the First Order thinks that power and control is what they want. In reality, it's not what they, I think, in theory, were built upon. So.
Well, one thing I think is interesting is the Empire as we know it, came about pretty, I guess you'd say fairly quickly. You when you watch
Yeah.
episode 3, it's right there.
It's already in place, basically.
Yeah, the infrastructure was basically already in place, and it was a clean takeover. And then you look at the First Order, and they fought and struggled for that takeover, and they
didn't
succeeded.
even get a takeover, really.
Well, I would say that they succeeded. I mean, they plunged the galaxy into chaos by taking out the leadership.
New Republic.
Yeah, the Republic, and now all that's left is them. So I'd say they succeeded, but what's interesting is now that they've succeeded, how are they going to perform? And I hope we get a good fallout of that in this next one. And that's leading into your Palpatine tangent. I hope that they fail as leaders of the galaxy, and that ties into Palpatine just y'all are nothing to me, because they might have won and got control, but then they can't maintain it because they don't know what they're doing,
Right. The interesting other point about that is we don't really know what Kylo wants. It doesn't seem that Kylo is all that interested in like galaxy-wide rule, and I don't think Snoke necessarily was either. But we still don't really know what Snoke's game was either. But the idea now that like with Kylo being supreme leader, I think you're definitely going to have that conflict and coup of Hux trying to take things over, because I think Kylo is just not going to want to have like this militaristic, galaxy-wide takeover. I think that his goals are above that. And I think that that'll disappoint people like Hux and ultimately create a lot of internal conflict within the First Order. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, especially since there's so many plot lines to cover in 9.
There's a lot to look forward to with Episode 9.
Yeah, of course. We could talk about the Resistance and the Rebellion. Again, kind of going back to just very different styles and backgrounds in terms of what their goals are and like where they come from. The Rebellion was built out of just basically everybody who couldn't stand the Empire rule, whereas the Resistance is just this government funded resistance group to fight against terrorism in the galaxy. But really, the Republic wants nothing to do with them. The Republic wants this pacifist sort of leadership and mindset. So, like, they're afraid to fuel money into the Resistance. And there's just this really different power struggle and dynamic between these two groups, because it's not so much fighting for control of the galaxy as much as it is just kind of this 40-year-old war that just has not stopped. Just an interesting dynamic.
One thing I find a little interesting too is the rebellion from A New Hope is basically from our point of view, the good guy version of the First Order, and you could say that in A New Hope they, for the most part, succeeded. Not to the same level that I guess the First Order succeeded in wiping out the Republic, but there's some parallels between the two, just on opposite sides of the playing field, I guess you could say. And
yeah, I would agree.
But the Resistance, honestly, why are they even called the Resistance? I don't know, it just seems a little off to me. But
they're resisting the First Order.
Yeah, but
it's like the idea.
Call yourself a resistance.
Oh, I get what you're saying. Absolutely,
I don't know. That's been like my only nitpick with the. Well, I have a few, but that was one of my bigger nitpicks with the sequel trilogy. Is like it just some of the names of that was just, I don't know. It seemed a little. It should have been explained a little better in the movies, I think. But overall, not a big deal. But
I think that's a lot of people's problem too. It's just things were not explained well. That time gap was not explained very well. It still hasn't been explained all that well.
Yeah.
We have like general layouts of what was happening during that time, but we don't have a full understanding.
Yeah, but as a comparison between the Resistance and the Rebellion, both were very small at the start. The only
Absolutely.
big difference is the resistance got even smaller.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens to the resistance come episode 9. I mean, that's something else, you know. Will it be small still? Will they have gained more strength? Like,
Well, this is something we're going to talk about in a minute, but like,
yeah.
you know, episode 9 predictions in comparison to Return of the Jedi. But you have this really interesting dynamic, and I would like to move into this. We'll just use this as our segue into that discussion of just what will happen in 9 in comparison to Return of the Jedi. But like, the rebellion was fighting to stop the galaxy-wide tyranny of the Empire. The resistance is fighting to stop the First Order from taking over a government that they already approve. But now that government's gone. And we know now that basically from books and, of course, the movies just kind of explain this to us softly, but the pacifist movement of the New Republic did not work. You know, it got them destroyed. So now you have the question of the resistance isn't necessarily fighting to repair the government of the past. Now it needs to not only stop the First Order, but it needs to also build a new government. One built on either, you could say, cooperation between like the light and the dark, which is a theme that I think we're going to get into a little bit of where episode 9 is going. But also you just have a very different power dynamic between the two factions and where we're going in episode 9. Because I think we are going to get that standard happy ending with Kylo kind of turning back to the light side, and he probably dies, and Rey probably becomes like this Skywalker figure, and the Skywalker name is used as the next generation of Force users, like as a balance between the light and the dark. They're all called Skywalkers. There's no more Jedi and Sith. Like, all this stuff is pretty, you know, things people have been guessing about and seem like are very plausible. But I think what's more interesting is where the government goes and where the world goes from there. You know, if the Force users come back, that's really cool. That's great. Really happy to see that. But that's pretty predictable. Like, we really need to kind of look and break down in comparison to Return of the Jedi, just where the government is going after episode 9.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a tall order for that tiny little resistance that we got left to try to come back and win and establish a new government. But I think you hit the nail on the head with that, with the cooperation. You know, I almost feel like maybe it won't be so much a battle to see who wins between the resistance and the First Order, but almost like a truce. You know, you know, I don't think we'll see either side eradicated. I think we'll see an understanding happen, and then, you know, progress towards something new and hopefully better, just like you said. So
Absolutely. Do you have any more comparison points you want to hit? Anything you want to talk about episode 9 in comparison to Return of the Jedi, or do you want to just start wrapping it up?
I don't know. I mean, I don't really want to compare my thoughts to Jedi, just because I feel like one of the most important things about Jedi was the outcome of Luke's struggle with the dark side and Luke's, you know, confrontation with his father. I feel like that was just as important of a plot line as everything else that happened in that movie. You know, I've the
Right.
two major plot lines, and I don't think we'll see something like that necessarily in episode 9.
Would you say that Kylo's struggle with the light and his temptation by the light would be that version in episode 9? Do you think we could dive into, like, not us discussing that, but do you think episode 9 will dive into that more so and either have Kylo turn good or be tempted heavily by the light and then ultimately stick to his roots, kind of like how Luke did?
I mean, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we probably will see that. I'm curious if it'll be as big of a I guess a character arc or a plot line in episode 9 as Luke's battle was in Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, well, I mean, it kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah.
anything else? I think we kind of hit all of our points and
Yeah, I mean, we
got a good discussion out of that.
we hit the big stuff. And I mean, honestly, we can probably even do more comparisons later on with these movies. I mean, there's a lot to compare. I mean, we didn't get into,
Oh yeah.
planets and cities and stuff like that. So we could definitely do more on
Yeah, I
that on a later date if we wanted to.
Yeah, this is definitely something we're kind of getting back to probably eventually. And next week, whatever we do, we're definitely talking about the prequels because we've done 3 episodes now without touching on the prequels, which is my favorite era in Star Wars. So that's just a teaser for next week. We don't know what we're going to do yet, but we're definitely going to talk about the prequels. Other than that, I think we're ready to wrap up, Nate.
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, cool. So thank you so much to everybody for listening and watching this Battlefront gameplay. I hope you liked it. I actually played really well. And I know we're playing bots, but it's still fun. So thank you again for listening and checking out the podcast with us this week. We really do appreciate all the awesome feedback and views that we're getting. We've heard nothing but good things from you guys. We really appreciate it. We're still trying to do the Q&A thing. We didn't get a lot of questions this week or enough to do a whole Q&A segment, but if you guys are interested in submitting questions for the Q&A, make sure to either send out a tweet with Republic Outpost Radio as the hashtag, or just leave one in the comment section. We'll check those as well. Also, MediaByte, our company and kind of the thing that we are running this podcast out of, is currently hiring. We're looking for new writers, graphic designers, video editors, social media admins. So if you guys have passions in anything pop culture or the online space, please go to our website. I'll leave the link in the description for you to apply. We really would like to look at some new writers. We're hiring all sorts of different positions, but if you like writing about pop culture, whether it be Star Wars like on this podcast, or if you really like Marvel or DC, video games, Game of Thrones, anything of that sort, feel free to try and apply. We're still looking for writers. As I said, video editors, graphic designers, those are pretty self-explanatory positions. If that's something you have a passion for and you're looking to get your name out there, please apply. We're looking for people in those positions as well. And then, of course, social media admins. If you think that social media and the quick-paced social world are more your speed, and you, again, like talking about all things pop culture, apply for one of those positions, and you could be running our Twitter or Instagram account sometime soon. As I said, links for that will be in the description. As for me and Nate, we will plug our tags. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at RealSeanHussey. I post all sorts of stuff. I'm doing a movie now watching thread. I'm doing a movie every day all summer. So check out that thread on my Twitter if you guys are interested. And Nate, where can the people find you online?
Find me on Twitter at the Drunken Dragon. And then hopefully soon Twitch. I keep saying that, but yeah, I'll be on Twitch soon. Twitch.tv/thedrunkendragon_3 or something like that.
Awesome. And that'll do it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for listening and or watching. And as always, may the Force be with you. Peace.